All right, this video is going to really begin with 2013 and cover the events of 2013, 2014. But if you've been following the videos the way I've been recording them, there's a gap in time since the video on 2012. And since that's a critical year, I'm going to recap part of that. All right. Hopefully, you remember that there were widespread demonstrations in many Russian cities after the Duma elections of 2011. And everyone was thinking about what's going to happen in 2012. This would be the new presidential year. Towards the end of 2011, you'll remember at United Russia's Congress, um, Medvedev announced that he was going to ask Prime Minister Putin if he would run for president in 2012, and that he would step down. And of course, then when Putin said yes, he would run, and he said, if I'm elected, I will choose Dmitry Medvedev, the current president, as my prime minister. So I began the overhead on 2012 talking about Putin's pledges to the electorate, all of these wonderful things he was promising, most of which were never fully implemented. We talked about the riot, the Pussy Riot demonstration, and then the election against token opposition. Uh, Putin comes in with 63% of the vote. Election observers said it was relatively fair. There was in certain regions there was ballot stuffing. There were, as typical in a Russian election, there are some regions where they seem to get more than 100% of registered voters, which is always a good sign for real democracy. Um, protest Protesters came out into the streets after the election in March, tens of thousands, claiming that they wanted Russia without Putin. They wanted a real democracy. The police in 2012 really cracked down on these demonstrators violently. They charged into the crowds with truncheons, billy clubs, um, and beat many of the protesters and arrested thousands. And I talked about how Medvedev tried to justify his legacy as he was stepping down. We talked about how the president was trying to get more control, Putin in June, getting more control over the Federation Council. Talked about the dismissal of the Minister of Defense and how this was for bribery charges, the typical charges that are leveled against any opponents. But this seems to be more a controversy between factions of the Silovoki. Um, and groups forming within the defense and the intelligence services and arguing against each other and going after one. Um, then I did talk about the Magnitsky Act in the United States. I hope I talked about that. If not, I'm going to recount a little bit about it. This was an example where a Western American investor, a guy named William Broder, had invested in a number of Russian companies, and they weren't doing as well as he expected, and he felt that money was being siphoned off, that there was corruption taking place. So he hired a Russian um, uh, accountant to investigate the books of these companies, and he had a right because he was a substantial shareholder of those companies. This guy, his name was Magnitsky. Well, he gets arrested and charged with being the source for the corruption in these companies. So he gets arrested, he gets into pre-trial detention, which is typical in Russia, and he's got some health issues. He's beaten in his interrogations, um, denied medical care, and he dies while in custody. Um, and Broder sues the Russian government for this, and he also lobbies Congress, the United States Congress, to take action. So they passed an act where they leveled sanctions against a number of the people who were involved in the arrest of the heads of the police, etc., the prison complex. And of course, this then provokes a drastic response from Putin, who doesn't want any infringements on his sovereign democracy. And he then bans the adoption of Russian children by Americans, using the excuse of a tragedy that happened in Texas. A young boy who had been adopted by an American couple was abused and neglected and died. And so this became a scandal that Putin was able to use to try to counter the effects of the Magnitsky Act. And then, if you remember, and I think this says much about the way Putin looks at democracy, that statement that he makes at the end of 2012, where he says, following the letter of the law does not contradict democracy. Following the letter of the law does not contradict democracy. So he's justifying the fact that he has switched from prime minister to president, that he's following the letter of the 93 Constitution, but certainly not the spirit of that Constitution. All right, so 2013 begins with Putin using the authority of the president to essentially fire the governor of the southern region called Dagestan. Dagestan is a largely Muslim republic in the Russian Federation, right next to the Chechen Republic. Chechen rebels have invaded Dagestan a couple times, trying to stir up a rebellion there. And there's lingering resistance, there's occasional terrorist activity, and Putin believes that the governor has not been strong enough, so he forces him out and appoints his own designee as the governor. Then, some of you might remember there was a big spectacular meteorite in February 15, 2013 that exploded over Russia, was captured on many people's phones, videos that went around the world. That was kind of spectacular. That has nothing to do with Russian politics, though. However, in February, the new prime minister, the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, pushes the Duma to reform election laws again and return what the sheet says SMDs. I'm wondering, does anybody know what SMD stands for? Well, not I'm going to explain it. It is the return of single-member districts. Now remember, the single-member districts were banned because they tended to be people who got elected, not on a party list, but that had a reputation, some notoriety, some important positions. They could run and get elected as in these single-member districts, and then they would have to join with others in the Duma to form some type of coalition. But it was a source of a number of prominent critics would get elected, and then they'd have immunity when they were in the Duma, and they could, criticize the Putin-Medvedev regime. And Putin did away with that. He forced all elections for the Duma to come off of the party list, and that would try to make the Duma a little bit more malleable. Well, as a result of the protest against the Duma election in 11 and against the presidential election in 12, Medvedev agrees that they need to go back and reinstate the single-member districts. In March 3rd of 2013, Boris Berezovsky, that longtime critic of Vladimir Putin, dies of natural causes in London. And in March, we have this presidential election in which, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong. We need to go then to in April of 2013, the protests against the Magnitsky sanctions, because Russia is feeling that this is the United States interfering in domestic affairs. And again, remember, Putin does not want to be lectured on how a democracy should operate. So they're really they're taking action. They take action to ban a number of imports of American goods and food supplies, food stocks into Russia. In May, I want to mention this Russian Silicon Valley because we haven't talked about that. But Russia has a lot of very good technical universities. They graduate a lot of very sophisticated engineers, mathematicians, and yet they don't have that entrepreneurial spirit. As Putin has been cracking down and forcing more of these national champions, as he calls it, these big monopolies in the industries, there's not a lot of sense for these young creative entrepreneurs to grow and develop high-tech companies. So in 2009, when Medvedev was president, they put a lot of money in building this new area near Moscow, Skolkovkov, and I'll spell it Skol, Skolkovkov, Kovo. And this Skolkokov, Skolkokov Innovation Center was going to be the hub of a new Russian Silicon Valley. They built many of these futuristic style buildings. They built the buildings close enough that people would be walking and riding bicycles, trying to limit the number of cars. Um, they improved the water system so that this area uses far less water than any other Russian city or region. They did a lot of innovative things, but they were encouraging Russians to come and establish companies here. They put a lot of money into this. A lot of infrastructure was built, and there hasn't been, even by today, anything near the success of Silicon Valley in creating these new companies. And this has generated a lot of criticism against the regime that it is spending money on these high-tech projects and neglecting the basic infrastructure that impacts the lives of everyday Russians and more immediate impact. And so there's been a lot of grumbling about it, criticism even in the Duma. And so the deputy prime minister, a guy named Vladislav Surkov, who is thought to be the individual who has encouraged Putin to use these slogans like managed democracy and sovereign um, democracy to try to distinguish, to give an adjectival addition to the term democracy. He's a younger guy, kind of like Medvedev, involved with high tech, and comes to the defense of the regime. Um, but I think the failure of this is that innovation doesn't come from the top down. The Russian style of the revolution from above, doing things that way, tends to come from the bottom up. And that means you've got to allow a lot of independence and a lot of quirkiness, and that's not the Russian style. Um, so let's move on. Um, in June, June 6th, June 6th, 2013, there is a couple goes on television, Vladimir and Ludmila, and they announce to the Russian television audience that their marriage is at an end. Now, that Vladimir and Ludmila, you might have guessed, is Vladimir Putin. Um, There been lots of rumors before 2013 that Putin had mistresses and girlfriends involved with. So he was supposedly involved with a Russian gymnast, and then a number of these very attractive younger Russian women, rarely seen in public with his wife. And so they put an end to all these rumors and announced that the marriage was at an end in June, and they did it on national television. And that's something. Also in June 2013, Edward Snowden flies to Moscow. This is the man involved with the CIA and WikiLeaks, and he was in Hong Kong, and he fled Hong Kong fearing arrest, and he fled to Moscow. So he's sitting in a Moscow airport in June of 2013, and eventually going to ask for asylum in Russia, which Putin will grant. Um, in August 6th, Putin signs a decree that bans food products and agricultural imports from any country that imposes economic sanctions on Russia or any Russian citizen. This is all related to the Magnitsky Act. In August, President Obama canceled a meeting with Putin uh, over the issue of Putin granting asylum to Edward Snowden. The relations between the United States and Russia are beginning to really deteriorate. That whole reset that came in with with the Obama administration has not been working because Putin is more concerned about Western interference in his managed democracy. Um, I forgot to mention, in July of 2013, Alexei Navalny, a longtime critic, this is when he really gets a lot of publicity and notoriety, fame, because the regime is tired of his blog, and they arrested and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Supposedly, he was involved in a scheme to embezzle money from some regional timber company. Um, Navalny and his supporters claim that it's politically motivated, which it probably was. Was he involved in some criminal scheme? Who knows? When everyone in Russia seems to have their hand out. But this generates a lot of protest. Not tens of thousands, but several hundred, up to 1,000 people were protesting. Um, and after the day after he's sentenced to 5 years in prison, he's released. He's released and sent home for house arrest. This is this is Russian justice. Um, and all this is going on while the campaign is in place for the mayor of Moscow or the governor of the Moscow region. And Navalny had his supporters got enough signatures to get him on the ballot. And I think because of the protests of 2011 and 2013, the Kremlin allowed Navalny to run, expecting that he's not going to get enough votes to beat the United Russia candidate, the current mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin. But in fact, Navalny does quite well. He comes in second in the vote, and he almost has enough votes to force Sobyanin into a second round election. Now he doesn't. And was there some shenanigans? Was there some political conniving and corruption on the part of the regime? Hey, it's Russia, probably. But it still shows that there was a lot of opposition to the hand-picked candidate for mayor of Moscow in Russia. There's still a lot of grumbling. But again, it's large. This opposition, this protest is largely in the cities among the younger and certainly among the better educated classes of the Russians. All right, in September, on September 11th, that date is a pretty significant date, Putin has an op-ed piece published in the New York Times in which he is critical of the concept of American exceptionalism. That essentially he says that America is no different than any other country. It interferes in the domestic affairs of countries when it wants to. It takes actions that it believes are in its own interest. It doesn't have this, well, there's an old phrase, holier than thou. It has no right to a holier than thou attitude. It's just like any other country. And of course, a little while later, President Obama, writes an op-ed that counters that, arguing that no, America does have a right to this legacy of exceptionalism. All right. So that pretty much covers our 2013. Let me move on to 2014, and we're going to begin to talk a bit about Ukraine here. Because as you'll see at the top of 2013 or 2014, I talk about the protests in Kiev that occupied Maidan Square. Now, let me be clear, this is not the color revolution demonstration that took place in 2003, 2004. We are now in 2014. It's a different nature of protest. And these protests come out of the fact that the European Union and Ukraine had been negotiating for some Ukrainian affiliation. Remember, Russia has been fearful of Ukraine getting too close to the West, uh, looking to join the European Union, looking to join NATO ever since Ukraine became independent. So this has been simmering. But Ukraine has been negotiating, and the president of Ukraine, a man named Yanukovych, Yanukovich, Yanukovych basically was playing Europe off against the Russians. See who was going to give him the better deal. Because if you'll remember, we talked briefly about that Putin had been pushing this notion of a Eurasian economic union, where he was trying to get Belarus, Ukraine, and several other of the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, to join in a new Eurasian union. And he wanted Belarus and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan had joined, but uh, Ukraine was back and forth, and Yanukovych was trying to use uh, what leverage he could against the Russians to get a good deal or to get a better deal with the Europeans. And so, under intense pressure from Moscow, from the Kremlin, Yanukovych scuttles this deal that it was ready to be signed with the EU, that the Ukraine would have become an affiliate of the European Union, not full member, but have a lot of ties with it, and that would improve trade between Europe, Western Europe, and Ukraine. And when Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, canceled this deal and turned and said that he was going to sign the package of aid and deal that the Putin regime had held out to him, this provoked widespread response from the demonstrators. And this starts back in November of 2013. People coming out into the streets protesting. And they stay in the streets. They're there in large numbers from November and through December, through the bitter winter of 2013-14, and they're there in um, January of 2014 protesting against this. And the police have several times tried to break up these demonstrations. I don't know if you remember the sit-ins, the sit-ins in Wall Street. This is the same kind of thing. These protesters brought tents. They sat in Independence Square, Kiev's Maidan, Maidan Square, Independence Square, and sat in, saying they were going to stay there until Yanukovych backs down and reinstates the agreement with the European Union. And so occasionally the police would try to bust up these groups and try to drive them away. Then more people would come and would be back and forth. They had food lines set up. People came in and cooked and baked and provided food for all these demonstrators who were sitting there in the winter. Well, on January of 2014, some of the demonstrators broke off and decided, why stay outside in this cold winter? Why don't we go into some government buildings? And they break into these government buildings, and that provokes again a response from the police, a violent response, and so you have clashes going back and forth. On January 22nd, a police sniper or snipers killed at least two of the protesters. And this ignited, this was a firestorm of protest that spread throughout the entire country. That the regime was using such intense violence and now they're killing their own citizens. Um, these protests continue. Um, Remember, all much of the world's focus is turning upon Ukraine and these protesters at a time when the Putin administration wants the world to focus upon Sochi, Russia, where the Winter Olympics are beginning. And, and I don't know if any of you saw the opening ceremony. It was this very elaborate glorification of the Russian past and Russian history. This was one of the dreams of Putin to bring the Olympics back to Russia and to glorify it and celebrate Russian history and Russia's status as a world power. All this is going on while the regime in Ukraine is falling apart. And on January 22nd, I said the snipers killed two of the protesters. On February 18th, um, the government of Ukraine sends in its military to try to retake the square. They're pushing the people out. The people resist. There's 20 people that are killed in the square. And of course, this only serves to bring tens of thousands more people out into the square in protest. The EU had been trying to get an agreement between the protesters and the Yanukovych government. They had arranged an agreement that called for early elections for the Ukrainian president, and that they would create a new unity government that would try to solve some of these problems. And while all this was going on, it looked like things were going to settle down, and Yanukovych disappears. He goes into hiding, uh, and several weeks later he appears in Russia, in Rostov on the Don, where he gives a very belligerent speech about how he's still the president of Ukraine and he's been forced out by these fascist rebels who are trying to establish a fascist democracy, a fascist government in Ukraine. All right. Now, why is this so important to Russia? Well, you know the legacy of the creation of the first Russian state was in Kiev. Uh, Christianity comes to Russia through the Kievan state. It has been an essential part of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union, and now it is an independent country, even though Putin argues that it has no right to be an independent country. And for military purposes, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is in Sevastopol, which is in the Ukraine, which is in the Crimea, part of the Ukraine. So while these protests are going on, there is some protest against Ukrainian government in Ukraine, which has a slight Russian majority in the population there. And so on February 28th, and this is after Yanukovych has fled, remember, the government has collapsed. There's going to be a new government, a new unity government being created in Ukraine. Russian troops, well, I put that in quotes on the page. Russian troops, the little green men, because they took their Russian flags off, they took Russian insignias off, but the names they on their uniforms, these Russian special forces troops begin to appear throughout the Ukraine and taking over government buildings, surrounding Ukrainian military bases in the Ukraine. Some of them are coming out of the naval base at Sevastopol and basically take over Ukraine. March 1st, Obama calls Putin, that's what the hell's going on. You can't be using force this way. This is the 21st century, and Russia, and Putin is that this is a domestic issue for Russia. Again, because the Russian people think that Crimea should be a part of Russia, and for many in Russia, Ukrainian is just an extension of Russia. It's the same thing. So Putin goes public in March 4th and acknowledges that these little green men are Russian troops, and they are there to enhance the defense of the Crimea. At the uh, urging of the Russian citizens in the Crimea that they felt that they were being threatened by this Ukrainian government, the chaos in Kiev, and they wanted Russia to come in and take control. And on March 16th, you have the Crimea, while it's under Russian occupation, voting to rejoin Russia. And this then provokes, as you see the next day, the first round of major sanctions against Russia from the United States and then the EU because of the invasion of Crimea. Now, this video has gone to 30 minutes and a few seconds. I'm going to stop it there because if you remember, I've said there's a problem of uploading videos that are longer than 30 minutes. So I'll stop there in March of 2014 with the first round of sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States for the occupation of Crimea.